Good evening. My name is Colin Barr. I am a lecturer in history at the University of Aberdeen and also visiting faculty fellow at the Klingon Family Center for the Study of Modern Ireland at the University of Notre Dame's Keough School for Global Affairs. It is my great pleasure to welcome today Dr. Robert Trainum, who is the head of external affairs at Facebook, who will be speaking today in his private capacity, and Professor Thomas Faber of the University of Aberdeen. Now, the way this is going to work is a little bit complicated, so I hope you'll bear with us. Dr. Trainum was speaking yesterday to my colleague at the Keough School for Global Affairs, Dr. Heather Stanfiel, and Dr. Stanfiel posed to Dr. Trainum a number of questions, which she's answered for us, and we'll play you that video in a few minutes, not quite yet. And at the end of that video, Professor Faber will reflect on those remarks in some more detail, perhaps answer some questions of my own. But first, I want to introduce Dr. Robert Trainum. Now, Dr. Trainum is a very prominent figure in American political circles. He's been voted for many years roll call newspapers among the 50 most powerful people in Washington, D.C. I believe that was 8 years in a row. He has served as the Washington, D.C. bureau chief, for Comcast Network, where he hosted their Emmy-nominated Comcast Newsmakers for many years. He served in a number of capacities. He was staff and communications director for the Senate Republican Conference, which made him the highest-ranking African-American staffer in the United States Congress. He was for several years a senior aide and press secretary for Senator Rick Santorum of Pennsylvania. More recently, Dr. Trainum has also served in various capacities at a number of universities, including Georgetown University in the United States and Cheney University, where he serves on the board of trustees at that historically Black college. In the last few years, he has become, as I indicated, head of external affairs for Facebook, where he oversees their external engagement relations on behalf of Facebook to reporters, nonprofit leaders, universities, and other leaders across the country. Now, again, as I've indicated, Dr. Trainum will be speaking to us today in his private capacity, not on behalf of Facebook, but I think his comments on the intersections of digital policy, foreign affairs, religion, values are incredibly important. As somebody who has stood at the center of all of those different fields and areas in his professional life, now extending 20 or more years in Washington, D.C., as a media personality, as a policymaker, as a congressional staffer, and now working at Facebook and also as an academic. So his views and insights, I think, are hugely germane to our wider discussion in this first pre-meet of the Bond Security Forum. So with that, I'd like to ask my colleagues to play Dr. Trainum's video of his interview with Dr. Heather Stanfiel of the Keough School for Global Affairs at Notre Dame. When that video is over, I will return to you with Professor Thomas Faber of the University of Aberdeen.
Thank you for being with us, Robert. I'd like to ask first, why are we living in such a fragmented and divided world?
Well, good day and greetings from North America. I am so sorry that I can't be there in person. And my sincere hope is that all of the individuals that are watching this great program are still safe and social distancing and all the other things that we have to do in this new era that we're living in. To your question, it depends on, I think, how you take a look at the question. Not to overthink this too much, but I look at this almost like a coin with two sides. On one hand, germane to your question, we're more divided than ever before. But on the other hand, we're actually more united than ever before. And what I mean by that is that I think it really depends on your perspective. From some people's perspectives, with the age of social media, with the age of more and more of us being connected through jet travel, the world seems smaller. And so by default, we are more connected. We are more intertwined. We know what's going on in Egypt. We know what's going on in Russia. We even know what's going on in China and some other countries that, quite frankly, have state-controlled media. Given the fact that people have smart devices and they feel liberated or encouraged, or whatever the case may be, to organize their thoughts, to record their thoughts and upload those thoughts, even when they know that there could be some persecution. On the other hand, again, germane to your question, because of that, because a lot of people have a lot of opinions, and they have access to even more information, that means that more and more people feel strongly about X, Y, or Z. And so to that degree, there are more and more people that feel more divided. So I think the question really does become, how do you interpret the question? And through your own lens, from a social equity standpoint, how do you process that question? And from what point of view you're coming from?
So what can we do about this? How can common bonds and a sense of common purpose be repaired in a digital world?
Yeah, I think this will sound a little corny, but I do believe this. I really do think we have to have, or go back to our roots around a moral compass, around fundamentally what is right and what is wrong. I think we all can agree, at least the vast majority of us can agree, that people that look like me, people that are females, have just as equal rights around the world, no matter where you are. I think we can agree that every single life is precious and is valuable. I think we can agree, depending on, again, your perspective, is that everyone has a voice and that everyone should be able to articulate that voice and to express their thoughts in a way without any fear of persecution or ramifications. But as you know, there are certain parts of the world, I don't need to name them because there's a lot that come to mind, where people that look like me, females and women and little girls, do not have the same rights. So I think it really depends on, again, where you're coming from. But the question becomes is, what do you do? How do you speak up? How do you stand truth to power? And I know that I'm dating myself here, but some of you may remember in 2010 there was a thing called the Arab Spring that started on social media and that spread all throughout the Middle East. Whether it was in Libya or Egypt or Yemen and Syria and Bahrain, where literally young people primarily use social media to demonstrate in the streets. And we obviously saw what happened to Hosni Mubarak and some of the others. We actually saw what happened when people felt empowered to use social media to be able to right or wrong. So again, I think it really, really depends on your perspective on where you are. Now, let me just be really clear about this, because I think there's an elephant in the room. Social media can be used or can be weaponized, for lack of a better term, when it falls into bad actors. And that's when it comes to NGOs, to governments, to people like you and I, and other organizations to stand up and to push back on authoritative regimes out there that are using social media to do harm as opposed to good.
So what do you think it is about social media and the current digital age that we aren't understanding about the fragmented nature of this platform? What should we understand, and what can we do about it?
Well, I think we need to step back as a society and recognize that, I know this will sound strange, but social media still very much is in its infantile stages. It's still an evolutionary product that we're still learning about. And we're learning more and more about how different dialects, literally how different dialects of a message can have different meanings and land differently depending on the tribe or the culture that you're coming from. Different in the word in one language can mean something completely different in a different language. And so better understanding that, frankly, we are in shades of gray, that there are nuances out there, that things are not literally black and white, and understanding that and recognizing that. And thus in the process, adjusting because of that, trying to not make blanket statements that are applicable to the global community, but trying to make rules and or regulations that are nuanced depending on the local situation. I think we need to do a better job of that as a society. That and I'm making this up, but let's just say actor A makes this broad statement on a social media platform that doesn't matter what social media platform, and he or she has 30 or 40 million followers. Well, those 30 or 40 million followers are going to probably interpret that very, very differently, especially if they're in global on a global landscape. So I know we're running out of time, but I think this is really important to understand that nuance says a lot, that context means a lot, and understanding that and embracing that, I think will go much, much further.
Thank you so much, Robert, for those wonderful and valuable thoughts. Thank you very much for being with us here today.
Indeed, it's a pleasure to be with you virtually. I look forward to learning more about the conference, and we'll definitely have to keep in touch.
Thanks very much.
Thanks very much to Heather and Robert for joining us. Before I turn to Thomas Faber and ask for his reflections, I'd like to introduce my colleague and friend Thomas Faber, who is Professor of History and International Affairs, as well as the founding director of the Centre for Global Security and Governance at Scotland's University of Aberdeen. Tom is a native of Westphalia. He earned his DPhil from Oxford, and before coming to Aberdeen, taught at a number of institutions, including Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, the University of Pennsylvania, and the University of Chicago in the United States, and the University of Glasgow in Scotland, as well as having held a number of prestigious fellowships, including at Harvard University. Thomas Faber is best known, I think, as one of the leading scholars of the early years of the National Socialist regime in Germany, has produced a number of books, most notably his most recent, Hitler's First War, his third book, Hitler's First War, and his most recent book, Becoming Hitler, The Making of a Nazi, the last of which was published in 2017 to great critical acclaim, has been translated into several languages, was among El Mundo's top 10 bestsellers, and was shortlisted for the 2018 Elizabeth Longford Prize, an extremely prestigious award in the English-speaking world. Professor Faber has also contributed to a number of periodicals on history and current affairs, on issues ranging from contemporary politics to the use and abuse of the term fascist as it applies to politics, and a number of other areas. I can think of no one better qualified really than to reflect from a historical position on some of the issues raised by Robert Trainum from a more policy and current affairs perspective on some of these issues of polarization, of media, and the impact of media on polarization, and the wider issues facing society that we'll be exploring in some of our other talks today. So with that, if I could, Tom, I'd like to ask with a very basic question, and turning to you really wearing your historian's hat and not so much your contemporary commentator's hat, although perhaps we'll mix those two together. But it struck me listening to Robert Trainum that the first question really is, what is new about some of the issues he's been speaking of? Clearly, we have issues. We have the issues of technology. Facebook didn't exist 20 years ago. But some of the underlying issues, some of the points that Dr. Trainum was alluding to do seem to have an older resonance. I wonder if you could start by saying, what do you think is old? And then we'll flip that and say, what do you think is new about the world he sketches out for us?
Thank you so much, Colin. It's a great pleasure to be speaking to you today after Robert Trainum, who's also joining the University of Aberdeen later this week as a board member of the university. But as to your question about what is old, what is new, I think it's a mistake to think that we're living in a totally different world. I think what we're expecting, what we're experiencing in the digital world, we'll return to that a little bit later, is ultimately just an extreme version of what we have experienced in the past, a kind of with the same phenomenon maybe on steroids. But I think in order, therefore, to understand what we are facing, we really have got to understand what's happened before, because again, the fundamental problems are the same, which is ultimately one of fragmentation of society and of and going together with that, a lack of common values. And with these kind of common values and fragmentation, democracy is not possible. Then democracy just becomes the fight for a majority of votes, but the kind of the fabric of democracy on which democracy can only live will die. Therefore, I think we really need to figure out, if we want to figure out how we can create the public space of deliberation for the 2020s, is what the nature of depolarization is. I think only once we do that will we understand how we can bring people together again in the digital age. Of course, the kind of the founding idea of a lot of social media companies was precisely this. I mean, to bring people together. This was Mark Zuckerberg's goal, but the reality, of course, has been often been the exact opposite. But that is not as such the fault of social media. I think they've played a role in that, but we can return to that in a moment. But I think more broadly, because of processes of fragmentation and of lack of value, and that have been going on for quite some time, and that we have experienced in human history over the last 100 or 200 years and before many times. But the problem is that we're not particularly good at understanding how to heal fragmentation. We are very good on understanding how things blow up, but not very good at understanding how to heal things, how to repair things. I mean, you've mentioned some of my books, and I'm kind of as guilty of this as anyone. I mean, I've spent far too many years of my life to understand, or to attempt to understand, Adolf Hitler, to understand how de-democratization, dictatorship, and genocide becomes possible. But I think in all this, we collectively have not really tried to understand how depolarization works, how healing of society work. This might not be as sexy as studying how things blow up, but I think ultimately that is precisely what we need to do if we want to repair democracy in a digital age.
It's an interesting point. I mean, if as historians, we naturally look to see, as you say, what blows up, what went wrong, and that's what sells books. That's what draws people in to explain the rise of Hitler, to explain the fall of Napoleon, whatever it might be. Is there a way, do you think, that we can, to take your lead here, is to look at how things are put back together? Is there a way we can turn some of those tools and skills that historians bring to this form of analysis and actually try and build on the lessons of the past about successful instances of healing or peacemaking, whether that's in the context of Ireland or Colombia or something entirely different? How would you see bringing those new skills together, or those old skills together, to help understand some of these issues we're facing, to look, as you say, at what works, not what blows up?
I think in a way we just need, in a very traditional sense, study the past. The past can be 5 minutes old, or it can be 50 or 500 years old, in order to understand the success factors of depolarization. It is not that we somehow need new tools. We just need new questions. We need to focus less on how things blow up, but on how things how things were fixed in the past. But in doing so, of course, we also need to look at what exactly we want to fix and what the goal of fixing is. I mean, it's all to say we want to heal, we want to bring reconciliation, but what does this actually mean? And I think there it's also, this is why I'm extremely excited here that not just Barr and Aberdeen, but Barr, Aberdeen, and the Keough School in Notre Dame are collaborating because, of course, of the special focus on human on how to restore the innate dignity of people, or how to look at integral human development. So in other words, I think we may want to, in a way, have a huge scoping exercise as historians and as scholars to actually see how was it possible that in the past people have managed to be brought back into the fold. How was it possible that the dignity of people was being restored, and also how the dignity of adversaries was restored? I think we focus maybe quite rightly on how to restore the dignity of victims. And that is, of course, absolutely important, but it is only one part of the equation. You will only be able to bring people together if everyone can deal with each other again. This does not mean that they all agree with each other, but that they all accept each other. So we need to be able to also be able to bring people who we may or may not consider perpetrators in the past, or as people who have driven fragmentation. We need to find ways of bringing them back into the fold, and how to restore their dignity as well. And I think if we therefore actually change these kind of questions, a lot of historical phenomena we look at the past suddenly start to look very differently. Let me just give you a few examples. So for instance, there has been a tendency in recent years when looking at resistance against Hitler and the attempt to kill Adolf Hitler in 1944. Some people say, look, this was far too late, and why didn't they do this earlier? Were they really just driven by honest moral considerations, or was this more driven by a sense to rescue Germany and all that? This might all be right or wrong, but it actually misses the important point about the lessons on how you can actually bring regime loyalists back into the fold. The point here is not whether Count Stauffenberg and others, whether they were perfect role models in the 1930s or the 1920s, but the point is, how is it that these people turned against the regime? How is it that how is it possible that regime loyalists, be they functionaries or be they ordinary supporters, how they can be turned? How can you, and once they have turned, how can you make sure that you accept them back into the fold? How can you make sure that you will then not constantly just claim they were not sincere in their change? That would be one point. Another point where a change of the question could be really fascinating, or a change of the perspective. Take the example of the denazification trials in Germany after the Second World War. And people, again, often say, look, this was all kind of a joke. They were, I mean, for those of you who are not familiar with these, in 1946, all people in West Germany were at least 18. They had to face local tribunals about their involvement with the Third Reich. And historians often focus on the fact that a lot of these people got off very lightly or were denazified, even though in reality they had deeply been implicated. Again, that is true, but it misses the important point about how these denazification tribunals worked in order to help to facilitate a symbolic distancing from the past for people who were involved in this. Yes, maybe it was a fiction that people were saying, well, look, we were not really involved in this. But in a way, they were very publicly distancing themselves from the past and endorsing a new future, a more democratic future. And it also helped them to bring them back into the fold. It gave them a space in post-German democracy. Yes, maybe there should have been more investigations, but maybe we also have got to ask the question. This is an open-ended question, whether in moments of transition, it's more important to bring people back into the fold, to restore their dignity, to allow them symbolically to distance themselves from the past, and that these kind of other kind of justice comes much later. And there are many other examples. Sorry, do you want to say something?
I just wanted to follow up on a point of that, if I could. One of the debates, I think, in post-conflict situations more recently than the post-Second World War has been exactly how do we bring perpetrators back into the fold, but also what is required of perpetrators before they are admitted. Now, in cases of serious human rights abuses, that is often a criminal trial, but in some cases that's not possible. Where do you think the line is between the dignity of the perpetrator and the dignity of the victim? I mean, dignity of perpetrators is an extremely fraught concept in itself. But if we assume that you need to move a society to a position of healing, whether that's in South Africa or Colombia or in Northern Ireland or wherever it may be, how do you weigh those two? And which is privileged? Is it stability that is privileged, the endurance of a settlement, the satisfaction of the victims who feel they've been given justice, the exaction of justice on perpetrators before being brought back into the fold is possible, to use your image? How do we settle those? What is the mechanism by which society weighs these? Is there a way of us to look to the past or the near present to say solution A is more satisfactory than solution B, or is that something that needs to be further investigated?
I think the short answer is it needs to be investigated further. But the slightly longer answer is to say it's messy, because it's very difficult to find the kind of the line where it just becomes unacceptable to bring people back into the fold. I mean, obviously, you wouldn't want to, after the Second World War, if you wouldn't have wanted to bring Hitler or Himmler or Goebbels back into the fold. In the case of recent genocides of the 1990s and 2000s, you wouldn't want to bring top perpetrators back into the fold. But once you go 2 or 3 levels lower, even of people involved in these crimes, you do have got to bring the people back into the fold. In a way, you have no choice, because you just have too many people who are deeply implicated in these kind of crimes. And you cannot rebuild a society without bringing the majority of them back into the fold. And sure, you could take the extreme version and say, well, look, before you actually fully face your own possibility, we won't even talk to you. But I don't think that is a way of how you get through to people. So I think you need to find that kind of line. And most important, but I think importantly, ironically, we may actually dare focus sometimes first on the victims, because they often actually in these moments of transition don't feel that they get sufficiently a voice. And once they feel that they have been heard, that this has been this has been appreciated and acknowledged both nationally and internationally, I think then the next stage, it becomes possible also for people who were more implicated to tell their story. A good example here is the Truth Commission of Guatemala, the United Nations Truth Commission of Guatemala. On one level, it's a total failure because their perpetrators pretty much refused to appear. But nevertheless, by other measures, it was a huge success because victims generally felt that they had previously not listened to, and now they felt that there was an institution with a high degree of respectability and of international recognition where they could tell their story. And it was that being heard that allowed them to move on. And mediators also say it's not necessarily the question that people necessarily feel that they need to be, that the other side needs to be fully, for instance, they need conviction. So sometimes even in victims of crimes, they're kind of fine if the perpetrator, even if the perpetrator doesn't get quite the punishment that they'd hoped for, as long as there is a trial, and as long, obviously, there's not just a whitewash in the trial. So in that sense, it is that process that is incredibly important. It is important for victims to get their voice, but also to just, as we're already in Latin America, it's so easy always to find examples where things didn't quite work. And of course, never these processes of transition work beautifully. Necessarily, they don't. But take the case of Chile. Chile was such a fragmented society. To many levels, of course, it is. And yet, after the end of the dictatorship, ultimately, Chilean society managed to come back together, and they managed to create a political system, a public forum of deliberation where they could speak together again and where they could find a way of doing politics.
Let me just link this back to some of the things that Robert Trainham was talking about, these issues of social media and the changes that brings, and whether, again, picking up this idea of what is old, but what also is new. Is it, do you think, significantly more difficult now to build that sort of societal consensus or find a way to work through a process in an extreme environment where they're, like, take in Chile, where the Pinochet regime is transitions to democracy, or in Rwanda, where the regime is overthrown by a resistance group, or any number of different examples? Is civil society any longer capable of having the space to find the appropriate mechanism to hear people, to listen to accounts of victims, to understand, to hear confessions of perpetrators? Or is it now all too noisy, too quick? Everything is mediated through Twitter, through Facebook, through Instagram. Is this where something is new, that polarization that seems to come along with social media? Has that made this process inherently more difficult, impossible, or is there some way this can actually, in your view, facilitate some of these patterns we're talking about, where the technology that is new today is actually going to advance some of the processes you've given examples from the past?
I think it's both. On one level, as I said at the very beginning, I think what we're experiencing is very much the same phenomenon as the past, but kind of on steroids. And what I mean with that is that with the way social media work, with the way that the networks behind social media work lead to further fragmentation. It means that people talk to their own to their own echo chambers, and that this fosters a sectarian mindset, where it becomes very difficult to speak to each other. So, and that's the problem becomes much bigger. And one thing actually to say would be to say, all this suggests that the future will not be pretty, and that we will that we will experience breakdowns of societies, and as well as civil wars and so on in the years to come. That is probably in countries that are experiencing other extreme shocks to the system likely to happen. And yes, the digital world will play a huge role in that. But when I hear that it's like, well, look, we have never lived in such a fragmented or polarized world and so on, I'm always very doubtful. Look, I mean, my daytime job is mostly to research fragmentation and polarization between the 1920s and 1940s. This was a time of a world war of ideologies. We simply don't have that. Yes, there is some kind of disagreement between neoliberalism and maybe some kind of other ideas. There's some kind of different ideas between what one may call the Western world and East Asian ideas of ordering the world. But ultimately, this is nothing to do with, this is not anywhere as close as the era of the World War of Ideologies or of the wars of religion. But I do think that there are things that we can actually do. I mean, for one, we can think both in terms of technical solutions, whether we can encourage social media companies, for instance, to reward agreements rather than just disagreements. I mean, at the moment, of course, disagreements are being rewarded more, and therefore create more, and actually maybe also in that sense create more revenue for social media companies. So in that sense, it's very idealistic, but maybe unlikely to really get social media companies to change their algorithms along that side. But what we certainly can do is we can change policy about the rules that are governing the digital world. For instance, a huge issue in the United States, and of course, most of the social media companies, at least that are active in much of the world outside of China, are American companies. And the big issue here is: are they publishing entities, or are they platforms? And we can't go into detail about the significance of this, but this ultimately means whether or not they are responsible for the content, and what the extent to which they can be made more responsible to the content. But in a way, of course, I also always think about how can we actually not just come up with new prohibitions, but how can we actually excite technology companies and help them to solve the problem. One obvious way would be to help us to find ways of convergence, because I mean, any two people or any two groups of people have points of convergence and of divergence, points of contention and of agreement. At the moment, because of also social media, and as well as more generally the crises in the world, the points of divergence are really washed up, brought to the front. But social media companies, with all the data that they have collected, they would be able to help us to understand where points of convergence lie, because even people who may have radically different ideas on abortion, on gender language, on death penalty, you name it, they will still have points of convergence. They will still have this. They will still have some points where they have similar likes, where they have similar modes of dealing with each other. And in a way, this is about identifying those points of convergence. And again, the social media companies will already have these kind of the necessary data. And if we can actually really do research into this, if we can identify where the points of convergence in the world of ideas of seemingly divergent or sectarian groups in the world, I think we could start to think about how we can use this in order to heal societies, how to heal democracy. But this ultimately, of course, all can only be a starting point, because I mean, ultimately, I think this will all have got to be used to try to figure out where there can be common values, because the way goes back to what I said at the beginning. Death of democracy happens when there is fragmentation and where there is a lack of common values. And therefore, it is really, the goal really has to be to find where these common values, maybe also these hidden common values lie, and they might be lying in a lot of fields, but I think one way of exploring where they lie is also something that we will hopefully do in our next panel, which is actually to look at religious values. And when I talk about religious values, we should not just focus on religious values in deeply religious, who whatever believe in the transcendental, but also of secularized religious values or religious traditions of various groups. And again, there will be points where religion will just lead or these values will lead to more fragmentation. We know also now in the current world, various cases where religion is fostering illiberal democracy, democratic breakdown. But it will be even more interesting to look at where these kinds of traditions are fostering democratization and the bringing together, and to figure out where these kind of points of convergence may be based on common traditions, either in a religious or in a secularized religious sense, that might actually go a long way of trying to heal democracy in a digital age.
I'm thinking to the late American, both Catholic priest and political thinker, a man called Richard John Newhouse, who wrote a very famous piece called The Naked Public Square, where he argued that the public sphere in America had become empty of religion. And that he saw this, and this was a position associated with the political right in the United States, that it needed to be resacralized. And that became a partisan debate, is that people on one side of the fence said, yes, you do need to do this. People on the other side of the fence said, no, it's precisely the opposite. Is what you're suggesting that there may be a way to sidestep that debate or the partisan nature of that debate and use what remains in the public square that is common to all of us, some of which may be religious in origin, some of which maybe not, as a binding agent that can begin to heal some of the divides that Robert spoke about in his video and that we've heard about in other contexts? Is it a model then about not about sacralization or desacralization, but about what that remains common from a religious heritage, where individuals may themselves still hold to that position, but others may not, and that's actually going to be all right because they share the underlying principles? Is that maybe a route out as you see things?
Yes, I think so. I mean, obviously, this is not to say that the point would only be to look at these kind of secularized traditions. They could, for one, this could also be used for people for whom these traditions are secularized, as well as for people for whom the same traditions are not secularized. And of course, even when you bring these together, there's two ways of looking at it. You could just focus on the huge divide between the fact that one is a secularized tradition, the other one isn't, or you could sidestep from this and say, well, yes, but let's for a moment forget about that, and let's focus on the point on the points of convergence here, on the underlying common ideas of let's focus on not what divides us, but let's focus for a moment on what unites us. Despite all our differences, let's just accept for a moment all our differences, and let's see whether there is something that unites us anyway, because it is over identifying these points of what unite us, possibly through looking at these underlying values of religious traditions, that I think will help to foster a restoration of the innate dignity that people have, and therefore of a fostering of integrated human development.
I think that's an absolutely fantastic place to stop, Tom. I think with integral human development, which is a key theme and interest of the Keough School for Global Affairs at Notre Dame. And in our next panel, which Professor Faber himself will be moderating and introducing, which will begin in approximately 5 minutes, which I hope you'll all be able to join us for or watch back on video. If you've just picked up on this one, there'll be another video for that one. And some of those questions can be explored with colleagues who have both practical and philosophical insights into themes relating to integral human development, to the themes of this day of the conference. And with that, it only remains for me to thank Professor Faber in person, Dr. Heather Stanfiel, and Dr. Robert Trainham, who joined us through the video, and to thank you for joining us. And I hope you'll join us again in a few moments for our next panel. Thank you.
Thank you.